Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for what we hope will be an engaging conversation on passenger experience after a global pandemic. My name is Vidran Zebik. I'm the head of research and development at Entro, and yeah, let's start with a general framework of what we'll be discussing today. So, as we slowly and cautiously begin to consider life post-pandemic, it is undeniable that our day-to-day experiences and relationship to place will have to change. Perhaps nowhere is this fact more obvious than at the airport. More accessible airline travel has shrunk global and local distances, but has also presented a brutally quick and efficient method by which a pandemic is born. Within airport terminals themselves, long lines at security, queues at customs, and crowded gatehold areas all present potential opportunities for infection and transmission of COVID. In this way, airport terminals present an important line of defense against COVID. In today's session, we will discuss design solutions to support COVID-resistant and resilient airports to support the recovery of the air travel industry. As we look for strategies to welcome and attract passengers back to the airport, we need to balance the need to support COVID-responsive behaviors, as well as communicate to passengers that airports are safe and open for business. Will we see a shift as terminals focus more on passenger health and well-being in response to COVID? And what does this shift mean for passenger experience and the business of air travel? In the first 45 minutes today, our panelists will discuss strategies to support of COVID-resistant airports, while the last 15 minutes will be set aside for audience questions. So if you do have questions, please submit them using the SurveyMonkey link on the YouTube page. If you do have any technical difficulties, you can email Christina@entro.com. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, so please send them in and we'll do our best. Now, to introduce our panelists for today. Kerr Lamy is a director at Airbiz with over 25 years of experience as a consultant to the aviation industry with a reputation for developing innovative, cutting-edge terminal design concepts. He has made major contributions to strategic planning for key airport and terminal projects in Canada and around the globe. Kerr is currently leading the Airbiz team on multiple major airport developments in North America and is a key advisor to Brussels Airport, Phoenix Airport, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, as well as Delta Airlines. Hey, Kerr, how you doing? I think you're still on mute.
Doing well, thanks.
Good, good. Crystal Shoemaker manages wayfinding and environmental graphics at Denver International Airport. Crystal and her team oversee all wayfinding projects through the complex and roadways, which sit on 54 square miles and welcomes over 68 million passengers annually. After obtaining her Master's of Science in Architecture in 2012, Crystal also developed an environmental graphic design course for graduate students through a university architectural program and serves as the adjunct professor for the course. She's an active member among the Society of Experiential Graphic Design and has served as a speaker at summits about experiential graphic design topics and dynamic wayfinding implementation and studies. Hey, Crystal.
Hi, happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Hong Nguyen has contributed to successful design planning and delivery of a broad range of projects out of Grimshaw, New York, Melbourne, and Los Angeles studios. His versatility as a designer has enabled him to lead key roles in creative and project management process for various projects within the aviation, rail, mass transit, urban planning, and cultural and commercial development sectors. Most recently, Hong has led the design and management of Melbourne's Airport Terminal 2 Arrivals Hall, a major redevelopment of the International Arrivals Hall to provide a best-in-class passenger experience for all visitors to Melbourne. Hey, Hong.
Good to be here as well.
Welcome. And finally, as partner at Entro, Vincent Mathieu Graton brings a wide range of experiences designing and teaching within the industrial design and engineering fields across Canada and Europe. His expertise lies in design and management in diversified fields, including product design, interior design, architecture, geotechnology, transportation, and aviation. Vincent believes that a strong integration of brand communications, wayfinding strategy, and technology are the keys to providing passenger with a seamless, safe, and efficient journey. He has led projects for Toronto's Pearson International Airport, Clinton National Airport, Gerald R. Ford Airport, and the Aéroport de la Réunion Roland Garros, among others. Hey, Vince, how are you?
Good, thanks. Good to be here.
Good, good. All right, so to kick us off, I think it's quite obvious that airports present some serious challenges to COVID safety. Crowding, high density within certain locations, and queuing all facilitate the spread of COVID. How can we mitigate some of these challenges, both in the short term, and what are some trends and changes we see in the long term in response to COVID? So Crystal, I was wondering if you could share some perspectives from Denver International Airports in regards to short-term and long-term solutions post-COVID.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. In the short term, I feel like we've all seen some great responses to handling communications. Heavy communication is key. Signage is a big one. We've seen a lot of different unique signage, queuing, social distancing, like temporary signage on the floor, stanchions, things like that, and then heavy communication. But when we start to look at long term, I think it's really important to think about all of the short term things, take a look at what is working, what do we expect to stick, and then how can we integrate that more intuitively in our designs going forward. So some of the things that we've discussed or talked about is like intuitive design in terms of our new normal. And if we expect this to be the normal that continues, is like, how can we integrate lighting that invites a more social distancing experience? So how can lighting play into that, or projectors that can move throughout and be more fluid? Also, just creating a more fluid and flexible environment has never been more important. So how can we look at scheduling differently? Check-in times, security times, can we schedule, or can the passenger be more in control, or we be more in control of when someone arrives at the airport, and try to space out differently that way versus trying to create more space when that might not be allowed. And then, yeah, just scheduling in general, like flight scheduling, and when people arrive at bag claims, and how can we create more dynamic screens, and how can we use our digital technology to switch things around if we need to and space people out more. So I think that all of the short-term things that are working and the way that people are responding to them now should definitely be looked at in more of a long-term scope through intuitive design.
Just to add to that, I guess when I look at this, I look at it from an experiential design point of view, wayfinding and placemaking. And just like Crystal mentioned, I guess we've seen across supermarkets, airports, and transport, basically everywhere we look, we see kind of these guerrilla signage tactics that have gone up, which is kind of necessary because it was all, this caught us all off guard. So there wasn't really a choice in doing these ad hoc kind of interventions for wayfinding and so on. But from a long-term perspective, I'm not sure that that's the solution that we would want to go towards, especially considering it for airports, which is already an environment where people typically are stressed. And typically they already feel kind of the pressures of trying to find where they're going. So just adding so much more signage, and we've seen it across all these different places that we've been to, but I feel that it could even potentially increase the stress with people, because you see these guerrilla tactics. Typically these signs go up and they're bright colors, and in an airport environment, you have the wayfinding signs, you have the actual placemaking of the environment, and now you have this added level of signage or of stress that people are expected to follow. And as you've probably noticed, most of the signage we've seen out there right now is more do not do this, or do this, or do not do that. And that's why I think that potentially could increase stress levels. So looking at it more towards the future, I think it's a matter of changing people's behaviors without really intervening with signage. So having something more holistic and something more intuitive that people can do. So just a quick example of that, because I don't want to spend too much time here, but I think of where do people tend to congregate the most in airports, and you think like at flight information displays, baggage information displays, and so on. So maybe there's a strategy in the future where these things can maybe be spread out to naturally create kind of that social distancing without really having to tell people to social distance. And I think that would help the whole user experience as a whole.
Yeah, I think as designers, we're excited by the opportunities of visioning what a future airport experience would be, what a future passenger experience would be. So I think from a design perspective, in the short term, it is mostly airports are dealing with the response more on an operational basis. changing how they operate, like some of the items that Crystal and Vincent has mentioned, social distancing, managing wayfinding, managing operations. But in the long term, I think it's important to see what design can contribute. So at the moment, the airports is envisioned as this very practical, heavy infrastructure. It is a box-in environment. So I think one of the things that we are looking at, it's how we can design spaces that are that are specifically geared towards health and well-being and wellness. So addressing passengers' ease, comfort, and how do we go about that? I think, you know, one of the items that we'll be looking at is perhaps the introduction of daylight and natural ventilated environment. So at the moment, green space is kind of a luxury within airports. It's difficult and challenging to make it functional, but I think the integration of green space, naturally ventilated, that will be, you know, it helps in terms of air recirculation. It helps from a experiential standpoint. It will help alleviate some of the stress that Vincent mentioned within this very sort of complex and perhaps confusing environment. So I think from a design perspective, it is quite exciting.
Really relevant and interesting points, Hong. Thank you.
I think if I just jump in there and sort of maybe summarize some of the things that the others were saying, certainly flexibility is going to be key. We can see right now that there's a tension within the industry as to how to restart. We have documentation that's coming out from a number of different agencies and groups. ICAO and IATA put out some documentation earlier this week that looks at the short term and the long term. Ways that airports can move forward, and they start to address the long-term needs of building health checks into the airport process, and they start to address the challenges in the industry right now, where the airlines and airports just want people to get their bums back into seats, and they want to see load factors go up, and so we're seeing short-term initiatives occur in different regions in different ways, and the real challenge in the short term is again that flexibility piece, is recognizing that each airport could be different within a country, certainly within a region, and there may not be a consistent factor as people go from airport to airport, and so their experience, to Matthew's point, may make them feel less secure, less comfortable, because things are changing as they go. If they move from airline to airline, they may have different responses from the carriers and different requirements from the carriers, and again from the airports. So the short term is going to be, I think, quite interesting. And the challenge is not to oversign, but to provide wayfinding per the rules that are out there, so that passengers who maybe don't know what they're stepping into as they enter the airport are comforted and brought through the process as effectively as possible. Long term, I think the trends that are there now, so self-service, decentralization, biometrics, that will all start to flow, and health will have to find its way into that.
Good points. I wonder to some of your comments there, Corinne, to Vince, what you mentioned about not oversigning and providing too much information. I wonder if in the short term, that kind of information is really, really crucial and vital, in the sense that that's the way that the airports can communicate safety and attract passengers back to the airport. So how do we see the role of not just supporting behaviors, but just from a psychological perspective, supporting passenger, I guess, concerns and issues in a very, very explicit way, at least in this initial stage, within the fight against the pandemic, and return to some form of normalcy within travel.
Right. When I say, I think when you think of what stress is, and stress is essentially it's uncertainty, right? People don't know where they're going, or there's questions that they have. So I think the key there is to have that constant communication with the passengers so that they do, so basically they have less uncertainty as they make their way through their journey. So, and how that's accomplished, like we talked about just earlier, the short-term versus long-term solutions. I think for short-term solutions, I don't think people had much of a choice. They have to put up signage. They had to do it kind of in a ad hoc manner. You'll see even sometimes people put tape on the ground. But as mentioned earlier, I think that constant communication in the long term will have to be rethought. And I think we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, but even technology can help address that. And there's other ways, existing technologies and new technologies that can potentially help in that situation, just to alleviate stress and keep passengers informed throughout their journey.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in terms of wayfinding and signage, it's funny, as a wayfinding professional, the first question we always ask is, how can we resolve this problem without a sign, to avoid that clutter and everything? And so how we are handling it at Den is we have our wayfinding, and we want the passenger to be confident that you can always know where you're going, no matter what's going on. That's a directional thing. And then our marketing team is amazing at doing all of the communications in terms of COVID, and they have a way of lightening it up and making it, I wouldn't say fun, but like nicer to read, less regulatory. So we keep those two things very separate so that wayfinding still gets you to where you're going, and our marketing gives you the information along the way. I also think that we'll start to see a shift, and this is all new, and everybody, the insecurities are high in terms of, am I safe? Am I going to be healthy? But as we continue to streamline and learn, I think that we can really grow passenger confidence. And then that starts to shift how we communicate and what we're communicating, because it's kind of the new norm. The sooner that I feel that we can promote passenger confidence, the better. So maybe it is like, before they enter the building, what are we doing to make them confident that they're entering a safe place? I know some airports have integrated thermal scanning. Is that like something new that is integrated within security screening, thermal scanning, and things like that, that just, the more confident we make them, the less we have to keep reassuring them and feeding them with things along their journey once they're in the building.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. And we'll actually touch on this notion of using technology to support COVID resistance in a second. So hold that thought, Crystal, and we'll get back to it. I guess I have another general question about short-term solutions, in the sense that a lot of discussions right now have to do with using graphics or floor markings to maintain or help maintain social distancing. And although that might be effective right now with passenger travel being relatively low, how does this change as airports become more busy and there's more people within the space? Is it going to be possible for us to maintain the suggested 2-meter distances between individuals? How does this social distancing concept look within the terminal experience? And Kurt, I was wondering if you could share some perspectives on that.
Yeah. So what we're seeing, because we're working around the globe, is initially we were seeing that there were different guidelines being presented in different jurisdictions, so that it's not an absolute distance that's required. Also, if health checks can be done in advance of the airport, and we've gotten to a point that we're comfortable that people are healthy, then social distancing requirements, we feel, can be challenged somewhat. We also think that because they're guidelines and recommendations, that there's room, again, in conjunction with health authorities, to look at what's an appropriate distance as you go through an airport experience, recognizing that the large part of that trip is going to be spent inside an airport cabin, which is, of course, socially restrictive in terms of distancing. So again, it's right now we don't really know how that's going to progress, but we do think that there's room to look at what's happening to the passenger as they enter the terminal building or as they go through various health checks, or whatever those are, to then say, is 2 meters separation the requirement that's appropriate for airports? And is the 2-meter separation or 6-foot separation appropriate at each stage of the airport journey? So there's ways to look at that and question that. And then of course, there's ways to adjust processes and policies to make that effective and efficient at each process. So as an example, check-in, pre-board screening, and boarding may all have slightly different requirements. We think there'll be some, but we don't know that they're going to be absolute 6 feet everywhere or 2 meters everywhere.
And to put that into perspective too, I heard last week, I think it was Heathrow basically came out and said it's just not possible to have social distancing in airports due to spatial constraints. And even thinking of the example of an Airbus landing at an airport, if you were required to have a 2-meter distance between each person, we'd be talking about a 1 kilometer lineup for a single plane. So realistically, is it even possible to have that social distancing, like Kerr said, in airports? And what are the alternate solutions to that?
In the short term, in the short term, possibly, but in the long term, as you said, right. You'll hit a limitation very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, on the comment about challenging social distancing, something that is universally applied. Like you said, a system is only as good as its weakest link. So, to effectively implement social distancing within the airport environment, you get on a plane, like you said, and it's you lock into this closed box. So I think airports will have to be quite creative about how they roll this out in a way that will not damage customer confidence. So they need to be creative in terms of how they manage incoming passenger peak loads. Actually, there's going to be a lot less passengers, so there's space for them to reallocate passenger across the terminal, so as not to create areas where you have long queues or crowds. I think technology will be a big thing to this issue. Seeing queues in the ticketing hall or at immigration, that from a psychological standpoint, it doesn't help with customer confidence. So I think finding ways to implement technology in an effective manner will go a long way in helping alleviate some of these concerns.
Yeah, thank you, Hong. I think that serves as a good segue to our next question, which is this general question about how technology could be applied to create resilient airport terminals. In the sense that, do we see new technologies being adopted? Do we perhaps see an opportunity, or is COVID presenting an opportunity to deploy technologies that have been much discussed in relation to passenger experience, but not readily adopted and applied? And if so, what are these technologies? Hong, if you like, you can continue on your kind of point there about technological applications and how you see this shaping up.
Yeah, no, I think for a long time there's been an inclination for implementing and adopting a lot of new technologies to help create a more seamless passenger experience. And I think for a lot of different reasons, and cost probably being the primary one, airports and airlines are sort of reluctant or a bit slow to roll these out. So I think a key thing is the biometric journey. So that's a component where, as we move into this post-COVID world, where I think passengers are looking for more contactless transitions. So from the moment you buy your ticket to the moment you arrive at your destination, I think every step of the process, ticketing, backdrop, security screening, if we can transition towards a more contactless and touch-free environment, that will be better in terms of keeping that natural social and physical distancing. And some of the technologies are already there. So and it's being tested at airports around the world. So this will probably, our hope is that this will help accelerate some of those implementation. Perhaps the local and federal government has a role in helping subsidize or incentivize airport to implement these measures to create sort of a more safe environment for passengers. So we think technology will be front and center. You know, Delta Airline is already rolling out bagless or RFID tagged. Airbus is looking into technology to sort of sniff out biohazard. Obviously, that's kind of a long way out, but we're starting to see at least these airline industry is pushing to innovate in this area, and hopefully within the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see a more significant transition towards these contactless processes.
I also think too, it's almost a twofold approach. And I think you touched on it, Hong, saying rethinking existing technologies that are currently being used in airports versus introducing new technologies. And maybe Crystal can let us know a bit what's being done in Denver, rethinking existing technologies. But the first thing that comes to my mind are touch screens. There's been a big push in the past few years to introduce touch screen at airports and pretty much everywhere. So there may be a rethinking and a hesitation for passengers to use that technology moving forward. So definitely there's some rethinking. And I also see maybe a heavier use of personal devices being used throughout airports. So people may be downloading something that can help them from a wayfinding perspective or something. But the concern I have there is the more reliant people become on their personal devices, the less they pay attention to their actual surroundings and the experience that they're having within that physical space. So I think there's a balance in between introducing technologies, so digital and physical solutions. I don't think we'll ever get rid of those physical solutions, but to find that nice balance. And the more I think about it, the more it brings me back to kind of augmented reality, which might be something we see introduced more and more in the future, which really strikes that balance because you're using technology in your environment, so you're able to preserve that sense of place. You're able to preserve the placemaking, the branding, and the whole user experience without having someone constantly buried in their cell phone and not paying attention to the wayfinding, to the placemaking and the architecture and so on. So.
Yeah, those are really good thoughts, Vince. I have a couple thoughts on technology and using what we have and changing how we use things. The first one would be, yeah, digital directories. Before this, we were definitely using, or we definitely use and are considering interactive directories, but that will be something that we definitely reconsider. And same with FIDs. So currently, for example, on our concourses, you come up in each, like what we call center core, main area of our concourses, and you're greeted with FIDs, and they are at eye level. And as we all know, eye level means that you need to get closer to the FIDs, you congregate around them. You'll definitely see fingerprints on them, like maybe someone thought it was a touch screen. So our thought process going forward is to move FIDs up higher and increase the font size, which naturally allows people to stand back further from the FIDs and further from each other. It's a natural reaction to bigger font, higher you stand back, you're spaced apart more. So that's one really great solution. Just changing the positioning of FIDs. In terms of digital directories, I agree. It's got to be this relationship with getting your information at the airport from a device and then being able to move it to your own device and having your own personal experience, which I feel like is happening more and more overall, or in general, people relying on their personal devices for everything, ordering, looking up things and stuff like that. The other technology piece that I want to bring up that could be useful is, and perhaps most airports have this, but the benefit of using like Bluetooth or BLE sensors or Wi-Fi or heat mapping, and starting to, hopefully people are already pulling data, to understand when bags come in and when flights come in and all of that. But how can we use that to our advantage and look at that and pull data to understand where are large clusters and groups happening, what time, and how can we mitigate that? How can we reschedule things or shift bag claims around so that two arrivals aren't right next to each other? And I think that as we're learning, social distancing isn't possible with the passenger numbers that we were seeing before all of this, because most airports don't have this space. So we're going to have to get really creative with scheduling. And I think heat mapping and tools like that are a great way to start understanding how people are moving and kind of mitigating those clusters that happen as much as possible. So that leaves less stress on the passenger to figure out social distancing. And again, it's just more intuitive of how we're controlling the crowds.
Yeah, again, I think that echoes what's been happening in the industry for a number of years. A number of jurisdictions already have curb to gate processing, biometrics, and a number of other aspects. Call to gate has been around for a long time. There's been discussions about call to security. So agreeing with the rest of the panelists that those opportunities exist. It is that combination of augmented reality, your airline driving your experience to the app, and then whatever remains of the physical space and the physical limitations that you need to walk through, and what that looks like. One of the real interesting challenges, I think, from an experience point of view, is that as we see today, not one airport in the world has absolutely every good idea in place at one time. Some airports will be ahead in one area and behind in another area. And as we look at focusing on innovation through technology, some airports will be able to move forward with that reasonably quickly. They may already have large parts of that in place. They may already have self-serve bag drop. They may already have decentralized security screening or remote bag screening. They may have CTX units, which allow for touchless experience already. But there may be other jurisdictions and other airports, particularly smaller airports, that from a technology point of view, don't have common use systems in place, as an example, or a common use IT backbone that would allow them to move quickly forward on that. So the industry, again, is going to be really challenged with this. I think I used it in a previous conversation, lumpy situation where we're just going to see this passenger experience that's somewhat inconsistent as we move forward. And over the last number of years, it's actually been moving more towards a consistent experience. And so to some degree, we're going to be stepping back potentially a little bit as we introduce, again, health into this mix and social distancing and things like that. And as things scale up, the real challenge will be to see how airports adapt to that scaling up. As with demand levels where they are now, some of these things are going to be reasonably easy to trial. Going back to our initial point, flexibility is going to be key. Airports are going to have to be very nimble, I think, in the coming years.
All really important points. I just wonder if that sense of flexibility and the inconsistency of the passenger experience, what that actually does to the passenger experience overall. Because if there is all this flexibility, how does it communicate effectively to the person that's actually within the space? And what challenges does that pose? How do we actually communicate and create a seamless experience if the experience is going to be different from airport to airport or terminal to terminal?
I think that's also where technology can start playing a role, Vedran. So we talked earlier about having strategic placements of technology. Perhaps we've seen this happen in some airports, but wayfinding signs tend to be static, so just digitally printed images. But perhaps moving into the future, we have more digital type wayfinding signs where messages can be quickly adapted to changing situations, and those messages can be adapted in whichever area in that user journey, so that you can update those messages. So someone traveling, say, for example, to one destination could get a customized message for all the people boarding that particular plane that maybe can give them a little bit more information on what to expect on the other side. So I think the digital aspect of this will play an important role in what you're talking about here.
Virgin, it's a good point, but I think it's really no different now when you travel, or pre-COVID, when you travel between airports, between cities, passenger experience varies drastically. You go from, say, the US to, you fly to Singapore, for example, it's very different from the architecture, the wayfinding, the offering within the airport. So I think that's just part of the reality of just having different airports, different jurisdictions, different country. But given the global nature of what's transpiring, I think from a digital perspective, a global is required. So the challenge then we coordinate these global efforts, cross-border efforts to make travel easier. So, would there be a new international body that looks at standardizing or implementing all e-passport or e-health check, so that when you travel between places, you don't get into the issue of one country implementing a 14-day quarantine period versus another country or cities that are a lot more loose, low risk, so they don't have the same policy. So I think a approach is going to be challenging short term. And as Kerr mentioned, I think as we gradually adapt to this new normal, we'll begin to roll out sort of a step-by-step incremental change that hopefully will standardize some of these procedures and processes.
Well, point well taken, Hong. I mean, for myself, prior to all this, I never knew when I had to take my shoes off or not at security. So you're right. Sometimes I'm taking them off, other times I'm keeping them on. So there's a lot of variability even prior to this. And I guess this just adds another level of complexity to the passenger experience that needs to be considered. In that sense, I also wonder whether we're going to see something similar to what we saw post September 11, in the sense that there was this intensification of security procedures within the airport experience. And I wonder if we'll see something similar to that post-COVID, but instead of from a security perspective, it'll be from a wellness and health perspective. If anybody has any thoughts on that, I would be really interested to hear.
Yeah, I would like to mention that, sorry, Kerr, that I was talking about how we still hear, 9/11, this many years later, in our design and planning discussions, we often hear, well, that was pre 9/11, or that's the norm now, and that was so many years ago. So I have a feeling that this will have a lasting impact on all of our decisions going forward, just based off of what happened with 9/11 and how things have evolved and changed since then and kind of stuck.
Yeah, absolutely agree. If there's a health passport or immunity developed or other testing that needs to occur outside of the airport, prior to travel, there's going to be some sort of process. I think long term, there's just no way that as the world looks at what we've all just been through or are coming out of, that health piece will just disappear. It may be layered. It may be stepped up and down depending on the threats that are identified. So it'll be very much like the security of maybe level 1, 2, 3. Hopefully we'll come up with an international standard. I don't know about where you guys are sitting, but I'm seeing that it's hard to know, as countries and regions come out of restrictions, some are level 1 is the highest, and then other ones level 1 is the lowest. So hopefully we come up with some sort of international standard that everybody can follow along with. Again, that makes us feel comfortable. One thing I will note that there's been talk about flight crews potentially wearing masks, and all the way up to essentially hazmat suits. And I don't know about you, but I would be very uncomfortable getting into a plane with somebody who is serving me in a hazmat suit. So again, getting that consistent approach is definitely something that's going to, I think, take some time. But I think the international community is working on it. That's definitely what we're seeing, and they recognize the importance and the urgency to it, because that's really what's going to open up international travel.
Okay, I think this also brings forth this notion of how airports and terminals will change as a whole. And I think Hong earlier you mentioned this concept of more open spaces and so on. So I just wonder, in the sense that the last little while, airports have become more than just transportation hubs. So now post-COVID, do we see a shift back to focusing on their primary function, which is to move people? Or do we see an opportunity to have something that's more than just a transportation hub, with the renewed importance of placemaking and perhaps changes in the retail experience? What are different facets and components of airport experience, and what the terminal will be post-COVID?
Right, and maybe I'll let Hong respond, but my first thoughts on that is that we do see that airports around the world are starting to integrate shopping experience, retail, even swimming pools in some cases. So in the near future, I don't know if I know the answer to this, but I think people will have more, I guess, leniency to go and take a flight rather than go to that retail experience. But because airports now contain both those experiences under one roof, I wonder if maybe even things like Kerr said earlier, he had mentioned call to gate. Certain ways that the operations of airports currently work might actually help that. So for example, the call to gate allows people to kind of wander the airport, which might include some of that retail space and so on, without actually going to sit in their gate area because they don't know what gate they're at. So even things like that might help improve kind of that experience, that retail experience, and help expose people more to the other services that airports now offer other than just flights. So I don't know if Kerr or Hong want to comment on that.
Well, airports are a vital transportation infrastructure, and I don't see that changing. Now, what this new airport environment becomes post-COVID, that's really hard to say. Obviously, a lot of things will change, but the health and safety factor, I think it's just an additional overlay or an additional component of this overall passenger experience, and that I think still involves the proper provision amenities, for accessibilities, for things that will improve the passenger experience. So, retail perhaps will become a more contactless process as well. Instead of having, items that you can pick up, look at, drop down, it might become a very digital experience that's behind a glass box, for example, and that sort of links up to your personal handheld technology, and that will allow you to purchase a product. And these components are kind of vital in terms of an income source for the airport. And so if you take these away, if it just becomes about moving people from A to B, the business case for airport and airlines might not stand up to it. So I think these components will still be vital. It's just about making it safer to sort of engage with, and I think that's going to lead to a lot of changes in how we see the current retail model, parking, concession, and so on.
Yeah, I think that business case is a really important point that you can't disregard, right? It needs to be considered in the post-COVID design process as well. So looking at the time, we're getting close to the audience questions. Just one quick question before we continue on to the audience questions. Generally, and I think, Kerr, you discussed quite a bit about the need for collaboration and different stakeholders and different bodies in defining what air travel will be post-COVID. I guess the final question is, what role do we see collaboration playing in recovery? And I guess in practical terms, what do each of you from your respective areas of expertise bring to the table? And I guess, what do you feel is missing from the conversation? So from the conversation we're having today and that you've heard within air travel and airport terminals, what conversations are missing, and what's the importance of collaboration as we look forward?
I guess I'll jump in there. Airports have always been about collaboration. There's always been, it's a highly regulated environment. So there's all kinds of different players. There's cleaners to airlines to airport operators have always needed to collaborate and get the steps of the process in line. The new player in the room is health. And we don't really know exactly how that's going to play out yet, but it's undeniable that even domestically in Canada and the United States, there's going to be collaboration required, and then there'll be collaboration between Canada and the US, and then there'll be collaboration internationally. And I suppose the positive thing coming out of all of this is there has been an awful lot of discussion and progress internationally and consistently in terms of how we've responded to COVID. Technically, we're all in this together. We're all collaborating at the moment.
And I mean, one solution, like we've been talking about a lot of potential solutions today. There's technology, there's architectural solutions, there's wayfinding solutions, but each one of these solutions can't be looked at in a bubble, right? Because you could come up with a great solution for spreading out your flight information displays. But if the architecture or if the architectural design forces everybody to go in front of these FIDs or to force the flows a certain direction, then maybe one solution negates the other. So that collaboration, I think, is really key to make everything work holistically together and not having all the different disciplines find solutions that work for them, but may not work for other disciplines. So really bringing everybody together and ensuring that airports actually kind of get the expert opinions from the various people, I think is really important moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, the airport environment is not a single experience that's isolated. You've got people coming to the airport by cars, by buses, by train. So, you know, I think we need to look at it more on a holistic lens. So you could protect the airport, but are there ways to sort of extend that process early on, say at a train station, or even before that within the city? So the interconnected nature of, you know, how this pandemic has played out and the impact, it basically permeates through every aspect of our lives. So the airport should not be looking in isolation, and again, that calls for increased collaboration across different fields and sectors. So, you know, it's not an issue to be solved independently and in a bubble, like Vincent said.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that transitions nicely into our first audience question, this conversation about collaboration. So the first audience question is there a leadership entity that will analyze, recommend, or mandate the criteria that we are all talking about? Who is defining and managing compliance globally? I guess who takes that leadership role within this concept of collaboration as we move forward?
I can jump in a little bit on that, at least from what I know. What we're seeing right now is that a number of different jurisdictions, so governments, countries, are looking to international groups like IATA, like ICAO, to provide some guidance as to what they think they should do. And then I think it's going to go country to country. We're certainly seeing Transport Canada and Health Canada in here speaking about how to move forward. And again, we know they're looking at those international groups to provide guidance. We're also assuming that the airport industry groups like ACI and others are gathering up information from their member airports and providing information, as will airline groups. But I do think it is all feeding towards those international groups, where again, you can get a global international agreement. And again, that will take time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's my,
yeah.
I think, yeah, it's quite a tricky question, but the one factor to not leave out, obviously, it's what the health recommendations are. And I think that will form the basis for a lot of how we respond to this. And, you know, information right now is coming in piecemeal. So I think as the picture becomes clearer, that would help sort of create a better picture of who's the best entity to sort of lead this effort.
Yeah. Okay, on to our next audience question. The question states, thank you for your time and the great panel. Speaking of long-lasting ramifications and security issues at airports, How do we ensure that the often dehumanizing experience of air travel is not further impacted by this pandemic? How do we avoid being further driven through shoots in the name of health/security? Really interesting question.
I can answer this slightly high level. I think that I would challenge everyone, designers, planners, people who work at airports, to look at this less of a burden and more of an amazing opportunity to not only make air travel and airports more safe, but this is an amazing opportunity to make the process more seamless and convenient. Like, we're almost pushed into, how do we make this seamless for the passenger? How do we give them power and checking in before they get to the airport? We might see a surge of remote bag check, and we'll probably see changes in security when it comes time to health and contactless and things like that. So I actually see this as an amazing opportunity that we weren't forced into before, to streamline and make it convenient for everyone. Particularly how that happens in security, I don't know, but I'm confident that will move in that direction across all operations.
I think the way that we've seen it in the past, and I think the way we see it going forward, is that self-service doesn't mean no service, that exception management or proactive service comes out of that. So if a large majority of people are going through the process seamlessly and effectively, that's great, and that's a good passenger experience for them. And then hopefully we're still going to have people in the terminal building that will provide services to those people that need them, and they can identify them. So again, we started to see that with the introduction of self-service. We've seen roaming agents, and we've seen different services being provided, again, hopefully on a proactive basis. So we're actually hopeful that the experience will get better for everybody, and that you're not going to be stuck in line, which is not a great level of service.
I think this is where design really can have a big impact. So some of the items I mentioned earlier, when we relook at what the airport of the future might be, we can really implement, I mentioned earlier, bringing in daylighting, bringing in natural ventilation, creating an environment that is sort of clear and intuitive, easy to understand. So we have a broad range of tools to help create a more humanized and personal experience. So, colors, materials, the acoustic of the space. So all of these elements that plays directly into our perception and into our psychology of how we view a space, how we experience it. So if we combine that with technology, if we can somehow sort of create a more seamless experience from the ticketing, from the security, from the check-in, make that a very sort of seamless experience, and then the space planning and design can help sort of alleviate some of that and almost provide a distraction, or takes you away from from what is a very stressful process. So I think the opportunity is definitely there, and we're really excited about what's to come out from the design community.
And I would actually mirror what Hong just said as well, because the more intuitive the passenger experience is, the less stressful and the better their experience is. So whatever can be done to improve that customer experience will, I think, help to solve that problem long term, and to make people feel more comfortable in airports and have that confidence that they need, and low stress levels. And with the introduction of a lot of the things we talked about today, technology, architectural interventions, I think all these things will work holistically together, so that customer journey and that customer experience will be much better. And like Crystal said, I think it's a really good opportunity to bring these things together at this time. So I'm being optimistic for the future of airports, rather than thinking we're going to get all our rights taken away and we're going to get this and that. So I think just having an optimistic view and going in with solutions that are optimistic as well.
I'm loving all this optimism and positivity. Now we use designers and strategists have to deliver. So I'm looking forward to see what you can come up with. Okay, another question from the audience. What are you anticipating in terms of COVID-related liability issues in terms of traveler-facing language requirements and issues? So for example, using words such as safe within the communications of within the airport. Obviously, international travel is, global, multilingual, so on and so forth. So how do we actually assure safety within these, I guess, considerations?
One thing that we've seen, and it's been happening in airports since the beginning, is having internationally recognized symbols that don't really rely on verbiage and nomenclature for people to understand. So this might even be an opportunity with COVID that new international standards need to be developed to get messages across without actually having to use words and so on. So I think there is an opportunity here to standardize what those new pictograms or icons might be. And again, I think that will have to be an international effort, because if they change from one airport to another, you're just adding another level of confusion and uncertainty for the passengers. So again, that collaboration is key in having that consistent messaging from international airport to international airport. And I'm answering this from a wayfinding and passenger experience point of view, but maybe from an operational point of view, there might be something else that somebody can offer in the panel.
It's possible. This isn't really our area of expertise, but it is possible again that there needs to be some designation for airports, and that there's again a recognition that they're safe, so that each airport doesn't need to necessarily articulate through signage that it is safe. That's an interesting question. I think to how you convey the processes that you've gone through, and it might be through communication. It might be identifying, as Crystal said, that there's information that's going out to the passenger beforehand, and it doesn't necessarily require a liability sign inside the airport itself. But that's probably more for the risk managers of the world, not me.
Fair enough.
And we're always believe that less signage is always better. So the more intuitive a process is, the better it is. So no signage is good signage, I often say, as long as the process is intuitive and that people understand the process well. So, and reduce stress levels, obviously.
Fully agree.
Yeah.
Good. So that actually leads very nicely to our next audience question, which starts by stating signage aside. So we're all on the same page here. So signage aside, what do you think is the one tactile, minimal capital intensive customer confidence enhancement strategy in the near term we can focus on helping our stakeholders in the absence of clear regulatory guidance? So signage aside, what's the short-term solution, near-term solution that we can offer that's minimal capital intensive? Interesting question with some practical suggestions, hopefully.
Somehow tying and coordinating with health agencies a pre-airport health check. We think that you could tie some to the PNR, which would facilitate passengers not arriving at the airport who were sick. That may be medium to long term. So short term, that's a much more difficult question. But certainly anything that's done needs to be done sooner in the process than later. So it need, any short-term investment is really going to depend on an airport to airport to some degree, unfortunately, depending on the systems that you have in place. There may be things you can do to make the process more contactless, because you have a number of those pieces in place already. But I think certainly the health check pre-airport is something that we're going to really need to focus on as an industry.
I think related to that, and then we're starting to see a few airlines and airports sending out information on this, but a more enhanced sanitation process. And I think that's something that's visible, something that can be easily implemented by the airport staff. And I be working with health experts to try to figure out what the best way is, the most effective way to clean surfaces, targeting areas that are highly used. So bathroom doors, for example, things that are used and shared and touched by all the passengers. So I think a comprehensive enhanced sanitation process within the airport environment, it's aside from signage, I think that that's something that will help with customer confidence. Just seeing that something is being done, and at a very tactile level, will help.
Yeah, that would make sense. Crystal, any comments from your position at Denver?
I would agree with all of those things. I just, the bottom line is the quicker you can make a passenger confident, the better off we're all going to be. And sanitizing, face masks, all those things make people around you feel more comfortable. I feel like those are very easy, quick things, like obvious. I watched a video recently in Changi when they were doing thermal scans and just how that works. And they basically just have a portal, you walk through it, and then you get pulled aside if you're in question. And then I saw that they were going around asking passengers how they felt about that, and they felt really good about it. They're like, we feel good about that process. It makes us feel good to be here. So again, that's not like an immediate short-term solution, and it might not be a solution for everyone, but again, it's just confidence, knowing that everyone in the building has been scanned to some degree. And yeah, it's a lot about health and how safe people feel.
Yeah, good comment. And I think on that note, we're going to wrap it up. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate the conversation and your optimistic outlook on the future. And I, for one, can't wait to be back at an airport traveling again. And I promise I won't complain about lineups as like I usually do. Just want to get back out to traveling again, as I'm sure we all do. So again, thanks for attending, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.